From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. Francisca Aguiló Mora, thank you so much for joining me today. You are a senior lecturer in Spanish here at Columbia in the Latin American and Iberian Cultures Department, and you're also currently the co-director of the Spanish language program. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Now, I want to talk about the topic of climate and language, a topic that you have recently published an article about together with a co-author, Almudena Marin-Cobos. Can you tell our listeners where they can find that article?
Yes, it's in the journal Radical Teacher. It's online, so it's open access, so everyone can access it.
Great. So I'll post a link to that article in the show notes, so anybody who's listening can read more about that article after listening to this conversation. So I'm wanting to ask you first a little bit about your background and training. What in your background brought you to teaching Spanish here at Columbia?
I come from cultural studies. I did my PhD at University of Miami on Latinx women writers. I started to focus on bilingual writings, so I also had to specialize in social linguistics and bilingualism, and then that took me to second language acquisition, how I could work with all of that in the classroom. And so I started to do more SLA. And this is what brought me here at Columbia in 2016. I was hired as a lecturer, but also because they were interested in that profile, which is not only linguistic, but also is connected to this kind of broader cultural studies frame. I've also liked to think of language in broader terms. What I see too often in language classrooms or even in second language acquisition as a field is this study of language as something very, as a system, right? As something very structural. And although this has, of course, changed and a lot, I still think that our tradition when teaching languages in the classroom is still very much grounded on that structural view of language. Because of my background, I've always tried to do something else in the language classrooms and teach language in a contextualized way. Mm-hmm. So I think we've done very good throughout the years to include questions of social justice in the classroom, because language is everywhere and how we speak about things is so important, right? Language contextualizes, disrupts, it's everywhere. So it's very important to analyze how we use language. And we've done a lot of progress in talking about, gender, race, regional varieties in the classroom. And also it comes from a personal perspective because my husband is in science, so he's director of sustainability at his school, he's in physics. So I hear a lot about climate and sustainability at home. So I was thinking, that's so important, right? That's a conversation we need to talk about because it affects all of us, no matter who we are, how we think, right? So I started to think on how to include that in our classroom. And when I was thinking of this, I was talking to Almudena, a colleague and a friend, and she was having the same kind of thoughts. So we said, what if we start thinking of bringing climate into the classroom, right? But into our classroom. That's how everything started.
Well, it sounds like from your background, you would maybe be a little resistant to the way that certain topics are kind of added on to a grammar-heavy curriculum. When I was learning Italian, for example, so many times I would think, okay, here's a bunch of grammar, and then, we're learning about how CDs work. So let's add on the CD. Yes. It's just tacked right on. But because of your background, it seems like you'd be more willing to really not just have it be a kind of add-on, but something more radical and something more disruptive than that.
Yeah, that's our whole point. For example, in the materials we use in the classroom, there's some units that talk about climate, and it's great, or talk about women, or talk about any topic you can imagine. But again, there's been a lot of efforts in which we try to change the way we teach language, more project-based or more theme-based. But I still feel that the skeleton is very grammar-based. Mm-hmm. So like even in a part of our textbooks that talks about climate, the title is subjunctive, right? Okay. Let's learn the subjunctive. But of course, yes, it's through making requests from an activist point to make changes through climate. But I think we still, and I tell my students, I mean, it's teaching grammar is important, but these are just tools to do something else.
Yeah.
It's not the end goal.
Right.
And I think this is kind of, it may seem obvious, but I think sometimes it's not so obvious. We see at Columbia, Barnard, and many other institutions that we talk about climate humanities or environmental humanities. And they are trying to do all these paradigmatic changes because climate is considered to be science, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So these other disciplines are starting to talk climate and to study climate and to research climate, let's say English, anthropology, etc. What we found is that languages are never kind of part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And specifically, second languages are normally never part of the conversation when we talk humanities. It's like if we were an add-on ourselves, right?
Yes, yeah.
And when we talk about climate, now we are starting to realize that it's so important that we had listened these other voices, which are scientific as well, right? In other terms. So second languages should be really part of the conversation. So that's how I started. So how, as a discipline, more than as an add-on or as a topic in our courses, we should start rethinking. And that then deals with the idea of how do we teach language? How can we teach language if we want to teach it from a sustainable? Mm-hmm. It's not so much as teaching sustainability, but also having sustainable teaching practices, right?
Yeah. You know, reading your article, one of the metaphors that really struck me was that of the tree trunk. And can you sort of tell us what that's all about?
Yeah, that comes from the Integrate project. You can find the reference in the article, in which what they explain, it's an initiative that promotes the teaching of climate and sustainability, not necessarily languages, but in general. So what they say that is what you are saying is your syllabus is designed a certain way, then everything else you add is seen as extra work. You know? Mm-hmm. You need more time, you need more hours to prepare, and then you are not teaching, let's say, I'm not demonizing teaching grammar. I'm just saying it needs to be done contextually. But then it's seen as adding that add-on, that extra, right, it's an overload for the instructor. Also because this idea that the instructor is the only source of knowledge, so integrating climate to sustainability that's why we also talk about transdisciplinarity, right? You don't need to know about everything. But so what they say is that instead of just adding what we said, a task in a course, is just creating the whole course around climate and sustainability. And we take this metaphor, but we go beyond, because what we see is that it's much easier and more common to find advanced content courses, let's say in our departments. Think of Spanish, English, Italian, after the language program, right? Mm-hmm. You can see courses starting to be focused on climate and sustainability, but the students that get to those courses are just a few,
right?
Especially in the humanities, right? So what we're thinking, these are branches that we imagine that tree as the whole, let's say, department, or even you can think of it as university-wide, in which our language program, because it's a requirement, has so many students that, you know, before getting to those branches of the tree, need to start at the trunk, which is our basic language programs. So there is when we need to start talking climate. And then also, continuing with the metaphor, is the roots of it, right? How we grow that tree is that maybe paradigm shift we are thinking of. How do we teach language so that this climate and sustainability in broad terms can start having a space in the trunk of the tree?
So what you're suggesting is that, just so that it's clear to me, a class that's maybe a first semester Spanish class or a third semester Spanish class would be oriented around the issues of climate and sustainability.
Exactly. We are not proposing that we talk about the same topics all the time. It's more climate and sustainability should be more a kind of teaching philosophy, right?
Yeah.
Those sustainable practices should start from the beginning. And it's not just talking about climate change. It's having this ideology of
Right.
being sustainable.
Yeah.
Again, in the broader sense, in the sense of the humanities, the sense of what it is to be humans and which connections do we have with nature, and which of our practices should we question? Because sometimes, in general, we do it with a kind of instrumental goal in our mind. We think that is kind of neutral, right? But it's not neutral. I mean, teaching some ways is erasing some other ways of teaching, or teaching certain varieties is erasing other varieties.
You know, as one considers a different kind of language curriculum, what are some of these underlying assumptions that perhaps we have that we think are neutral, but actually aren't neutral, and that maybe are favoring certain positions, certain discourses, certain rhetorical traditions with more power than others? And how can you try in your language classroom to challenge those hierarchies?
I think, for example, in the Spanish classes, we have done efforts to widen the regional varieties we are teaching. So not only the peninsular one, but also Colombian, Cuban, etc. But there's still this notion that a Cuban person talks this way, right? Or a Colombian person. And that variety that we show them, it's very much like cleaned. So it's the variety you imagine for that country, for that notion of nation you have in your mind. But it's never, let's say, accented too much.
Okay.
You never have incursions of other languages. For example, with heritage students, we work a lot with Spanglish and how bilingualism is normal, and we study the systematicity of bilingual discourse, etc. But we don't do it in regular second language classrooms. It's kind of, we clean, although even if we have expanded the varieties, we never show a Spanish talked by a Quechua hablante in Peru that has, incursions of the Quechua language, for example.
Yeah.
So a simple thing to do that is diversifying and widening the type of text in all its,
Sure.
that you show to students so that they see the language as it is. More descriptive way of teaching, right?
And the way that individual speakers use maybe Spanish as part, but not the entirety of their linguistic repertoire.
Exactly.
There was a great project from Harvard done by Claire Marie Brisson, who was also a guest on the podcast, that looked at some of the ways in which French in Quebec has interacted with indigenous languages. And so I was wondering, Spanish itself is a colonial language.
Exactly.
And so, how do you reckon the teaching of a colonial language with the desire, as you stated in your article, to decolonize and challenge colonial lingualism? Is it through this intersection of Spanish and other languages?
Yeah, I think that's one of the ways. How can we teach Spanish from that climate and sustainability perspective if we don't recognize because true, Spanish in the US is a minoritized language, and we work with that a lot in heritage language classrooms, but in second language classrooms, we totally ignore or erase the fact that Spanish has been, and it is, a colonial language. And it's still erasing other languages in contact. So one way is having a space for these other languages in contact in the classroom. Another way also is when we focus so much on grammar, we are focusing on the grammar of certain speakers. Even when we teach the subjunctive, which again, I'm not demonizing, in some varieties, it's not used in the same way. So again, it's not like always clean, So basically, also how we think of language, more as more than those grammatical and lexical tools, more as discourse. I think discourse is what unites us all. So if we think of language as discourse, and that also kind of gives us the continuity to teach language throughout all of our program, right? Starting in the language program, but continuing in more content courses, analyzing discourse and seeing language as discourse. I think that's another way.
Thinking of language as discourse may also be a useful pedagogical approach in the sense that it's not necessarily normative in the way that grammar translation is normative. And the language that second language or additional language learners produce does itself not need to be looked down on or minimized. It's really a perfectly valid form of discourse. It's somebody in the process of acquiring a language.
Yeah, as soon as you see language as discourse, then you are teaching critical thinking and saying, okay, this is the discourse that we create in certain registers. This is another type of discourse. Yeah, it's more than having a prescriptive perspective, just descriptive, and making a student, giving them also this meta-linguistic awareness. That is how language is used, and you need to know that even the language we use in science is also ideological, right? That's why these second languages, even dominant second languages, don't have a space also in science. That's another of our goals, right, is to decentralize the climate discourse, which is normally Western and in English.
So what are some of the ways in which you talk about the climate discourse, maybe in one of the classes that you're currently teaching or that you're planning to teach?
I think what we do, for example, in one unit in my intermediate 2 courses, we look at metaphors. Metaphors we use to talk language, and we compare the different metaphors we use in English, in Spanish, and in certain indigenous communities that speak Spanish, but again, they come from a different language, and it's. For example, we see that the metaphors that have dominated the discourses in English and in Spanish is the war metaphor. And then we discuss if this is effective, is not, right? And we've also read some articles in Spanish that are proposing to change the metaphor into metaphors or of healing, of disease, of like the planet is sick, right? Also because the point is that when we talk about war metaphors, it's like we are the ones we need to do something to fight, but sometimes we ignore that some different people are affected differently by the climate crisis. So a proposal that there is to think of a cure for the planet, because that makes you think also of certain people that physically are affected by climate. For example, the cane cutters in certain countries, right? They need to be exposed to the sun for many hours, so they have kidney disease. So other types of metaphors makes you think of the physical consequences certain communities suffer, right, from climate change. So, and then the students themselves search for those metaphors in the media, and they find that the kind of discourse is changing. And it's interesting because we had, for example, a professor from Universidad de La Rioja, which she was researching the metaphors used to talk about the CO2 capture, and it was very much in the crime, police, marco, the frame of reference. But she was also explaining that now she's researching which metaphors are used to talk about climate in Urdu. And it's interesting because they are mostly translated from English, so they don't reach the public, the audience, because the way of thinking is different. So even metaphors, if we translate them from the dominant language, they don't reach the audience the same way. So I thought that was really interesting, right?
Yeah. You know, it's really fascinating to connect the metaphors that we use in different languages and the climate issue, and then how that impacts the actions that people take. You know, it's not just a
Exactly.
sort of disembodied word, but it's an embedded word. It's a contextualized word, and it's a word that causes one action or leads to one action or maybe would lead to a different action. The idea of, a metaphor that takes into consideration perhaps the effect of climate change in people in a certain area where climate change is perhaps having starker consequences right now than maybe in the U.S. Is a powerful one.
Yeah, some metaphors are performative.
Yeah.
Some others are not, right? But yeah.
So can you maybe think of a specific task or a specific activity that you would have perhaps maybe an elementary level Spanish student do that's relating to climate and sustainability?
Yeah, so an activity that is mentioned in the article and Almudena has been working with in elementary courses, elementary 1 even, is if we are talking about the different students we have and how they can feel overwhelmed by the notion of climate, it's a great idea to think about New York City as our common ground. So there's the New York City Mayor's office has been running an Office of Climate and Environmental Justice thing. It was created by Bill de Blasio when he was mayor, 2014-2021. And it includes information about their working team, what they do specifically in the city, the hazard that the city faces. And there's this webpage is in different languages. So that could be used by different programs, and Spanish is one of them. And something that we do in elementary levels is something as simple as reading a map, right? Giving directions, saying how to put things in a map. So these webpages have maps of green areas and what has been called cool zones in all 5 boroughs. So in courses that are increasingly diverse in terms of social background and origins, approaching the city we are living from this perspective is indeed a way of understanding the connection between climate discourses and climate actions, as well as the connection between neighborhood, the demographics, and socioeconomic status. And this is something that you can do at the very basic level because they can talk about demographics, right? These people who live in this neighborhood is from this place, right? And they live in the north of the city. It's very basic vocabulary. So what do we do is that we divide the classes into groups, 1 per borough. Each group can have a poster-sized blank paper to draw and add the information that they will share with the class. The task is that they need to identify the areas where New York City has or has not taken action and describe those areas, what kind of people live there, what's their socioeconomic status, poverty, wealth index, and so on. And this information is easily searchable online, and we also learn at the elementary level vocabulary about nationalities, origins, etc. So they share the information in interactive round of presentations, and the instructor might facilitate a conversation about the findings, asking about the possible relation between the city's interventions and the specific area's living conditions. And as you can imagine, they get to some conclusions, right? In some neighborhoods in which the heating index is higher, not so many solutions have been proposed. So there's a lot of critical thinking there as well. And also when this doesn't cover the grammar as isolated, but in a context that they all share. But this also brings the shared expertise because then the city and this problem can be seen from, for example, the architecture student, right? Or from the public health student. So using the city, our surrounding with very basic grammar and vocabulary tools is something that can be done in the elementary level.
And I imagine that this particular activity could be scaled up in certain ways.
Yes.
You're just kind of describing what you see.
Exactly.
Where are there trees? Where are there not trees? Where is it hot? Where is it less hot? Maybe at an intermediate or advanced level, you could say, why is it like this? How did it get constructed this way? What interventions will take place in the future?
Totally. So I think that every text, every task can be brought in every level.
Yeah.
It depends on how you work. Edit the task, not the text.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
So in this case, you can also give them a list of vocabulary beforehand, but they are talking about nationalities, about reading a map, about demographics, about areas, describing areas as you were saying, right? So but But the critical thinking is there because they realize what's going on,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So one set of concepts from your article, which, by the way, is, I forgot to mention, titled Climate Humanities in the L2 Classroom, Radical Possibilities for an Uncertain Future. And again, the link to that is in the show notes. So one of the topics that you discuss is the concept of shared expertise and transdisciplinarity. So what exactly is that? How do you define these notions?
The thing is that what a lot of people ask us, right, when we talk about this project is, yeah, but how can I talk about climate? I mean, I'm not an expert, right? So when we talk about shared expertise and transdisciplinarity, we see it in different ways. First, I think this kind of proposal, pedagogical proposal, is more student-centered than ever. Because I think we talk a lot about how we are facilitators, how we are not the only source of knowledge, but in this case, I mean, it needs to be like that. I cannot know about everything, right?
Yeah.
So we really followed a very inquiry-based approach. Students are the ones that we propose. For example, I bring some texts into the classroom to analyze, to work with, to infer some grammar, but then they are the ones working in different texts in group because, I mean, I cannot do everything. They do research of projects. So we think of shared expertise through different projects in which students are the ones taking the lead, and also because we have students that know more about climate than we do. For example, some others are urban studies students, so they can bring the perspective of that area, or public health students, they can bring that. So we try to do a project-based approach, an inquiry-based approach, in which we also, it's a kind of co-mentorship, right? I mean, we teach them, but they also help us with different perspectives. That on one side, and on the other hand, it needs to be a transdisciplinary work. We really need to work with other disciplines, and
for sure.
This is a work in progress, but we are in conversations with other colleagues at Barnard and Columbia, so that we can help each other, right?
Absolutely. You know, one of the risks that I imagine one would run in teaching a class like this and structuring a curriculum in this way would be the issue of students' reactions and their affective reactions to this, because the climate crisis, I mean, you call it a climate crisis, I think that's the right way to put it, can become overwhelming if you think about it, and you think, I'm just one person in the midst of this world historical challenge. So how do you help the students or facilitate their affective engagement with this topic?
That's very personal, but I always, for everything in life, I always like to say that embrace contradiction, right? I mean, we are not perfect. We cannot be perfect, and that's fine. You will do good in some aspects, and you will do not so good in others, right? That's one thing. Also, I think that what we are trying to do is to promote nuanced ways of seeing things. I think also it's not just, I don't like just the pamphlet, right? Like I like to analyze with them all the nuances of everything. In fact, a last unit in my intermediate 2 course, we talk about radical hope. This is not my idea, but radical hope when we talk about climate. What we are trying to avoid is, it's a space between being too optimistic and being pessimistic, right? Because if you have this magical thinking that everything will be fine, normally you expect others do something for you, right? It's technology will solve the problem, or this will solve everything will be fine. Also, sometimes what we expect is to going back to a past. Probably we shouldn't go back to that past, right? With the COVID, right? With the pandemic, we thought that, everything would change, we will be different. And we just came back to where we were, right? And nothing has changed. Probably it's even worse, right? So if we are too pessimistic, then that's also freezing, right? We do nothing because there's nothing we can do, right? So the idea of radical thinking is embracing the uncertainty we are living in to kind of, it's a moment of creation. since it's a moment we haven't lived before, this uncertainty gives us the space to create something new that probably we don't even know that exists.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a way we could go. And what we do for the end of the year, of the semester, is that they need to do research on different initiatives or projects that embrace this idea of radical hope.
Yeah. It's interesting that the climate crisis has placed us into a situation where the Aristotelian mean is kind of that of radical hope. But it's a very logical perspective, and I think one that avoids despair.
Mm-hmm.
One wants to do something and one wants to hope. The final question that I have for you is about your class. You're teaching a class right now, and you've worked with the Language Resource Center a little bit in the context of an instructional innovation grant to develop some materials for this class. So can you talk about how this idea is all kind of coming together in practice in this particular class that you're teaching?
So we started by giving one of our sections of in our basic language program on from this perspective. It's called Intermediate Spanish 2 Topics on Climate Discourse. I'm teaching this section, and we started with Intermediate 2 because I totally believe that this can be done from Elementary 1. And I can give you examples of activities that could be done in Elementary 1, because that's a question we always have. But it's easier for the community, to start in Intermediate 2 because students are a little bit more advanced in the language, and there's a kind of continuation then to more content courses. But the idea is to slowly maybe open another section in the elementary levels. And all of this I've been explaining maybe in some kind of abstract ways. We do it in the classroom, and yes, for example, with the grant of LRC, what we did with the help of graduate students is to create this repository of materials to work with in the classroom that are not so accessible if we are talking climate in other languages and other more alternative spaces than the ones we are used to. Of course, finding those materials is more difficult. So that's how we spend this money and this time is creating this repository. And it's amazing, the things we have, even more than I can embrace. At the beginning, we talk about humanizing climate discourse, humanizing both sense, right? Making more human and also from the humanities,
right? Yeah.
How important it is. And we, for example, work a lot with testimonials. And it's amazing because you have normal people like you and me in different communities talking about how climate has affected them. And for example, they say, oh, before this used to happen and this doesn't happen anymore. And so naturally and so organically, we find the use of the imperfecto in the past in Spanish versus the present, which is something that we have in our textbook. But in this case, it's meaningful because these persons are talking about things that used to happen before to them, to their environment, and they don't happen anymore. Yeah. So it's what I was talking about, how grammar is really contextualized and is meaningful. Then we talk about metaphors. Then another unit is called Other Voices, and we work with these texts that are bilingual, that are not so mainstream. And then we have that unit of Radical Hope, in which the students do research on these projects. And I'm learning from them because they bring, and the projects they do research with need to have a connection with their interests. So an architecture student brings a project of building houses that are more sustainable in Ecuador. I don't know. So I learned from them as well. In fact, I made contacts with people in projects that I didn't know about thanks to the students. So
yeah.
That's the shared expertise we're talking about.
That's really, really fascinating. So you've done so much work on this already. What is your next step in this overall project?
Yes.
And you're thinking about the relationship between climate and language in the pedagogical space.
Yeah. Of course, about this specific course, there's still so many things we could do. We would like to create a repository of all these materials, because what we've seen is that when you explain it to people, to other teachers, not only at university level, but high school, people have interest, but they feel overwhelmed, as you were saying, no? So if at least you give them, so you can work with this text and some ideas how to exploit it pedagogically, people are I think there's a willingness to start working from this perspective. So that's one thing. And I think much more broad and ambitious, again, is how languages and second languages specifically need to be part of bigger conversations in the humanities. And of course, transdisciplinary with the sciences. This is something bigger, but I think it's something that it's not there yet.
It's a very large question, one that we all have to find our way to answer. Yeah. Well, Francisca Aguiló Mora, thank you so much for joining me.
No,
Really
thank you. I would
this conversation.
speak for hours. Thank you for your interest.